listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Welcome aboard tonight. We're going to discuss the Nazi occult war. Certainly in this world, there are ideologies behind the scenes that steer and guide and direct agendas in this world. And this is demonstrable in the events of World War II, as we will see here tonight. This one's going to be an interesting and wild ride, folks. The Nazis had some very interesting connections to many secret society groups, many of them from the German culture, the Thule Society, the Vril Society, and these groups had connections to other esoteric groups and had a lot of the similar background and ideologies of some of those groups we've discussed here before. Groups like the Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, among others, the Freemasons. Many of the secret teachings from all of these groups permeate one another, as we will see here. And many of the ideas that were foundational in these occult fraternities cropped up within the secret chambers of the planners of the war effort in Nazi Germany. And we'll see that there were those within high offices of power within the military machine that was the German Nazi Party during World War II. And these were influential figures who were able to influence and affect the world in grand ways. Not so good ways, by the way. Based upon these ideologies that they were taught from within the bounds of these secret society groups. And this is where all of this type of stuff always seems to stem from. And we're going to explore that avenue of thought here tonight. We're going to be reading from a book titled The Nazi Occult War, Hitler's Compact with the Forces of Evil, written by Michael FitzGerald. Now, there were a lot of connections made in this book, and of course I will expound on these with my own personal opinions and my own base of knowledge on this stuff, as I have been studying these things for many years now. And I hope that this information is useful. I hope that this information is valuable to somebody out there, that you derive value from this. You're not going to hear about a lot of this in much of the mainstream anywhere. You see, they always will acknowledge that this leadership in Germany at the time had an interest in the occult, and they did some certain things. But I don't think they'll go so far as to acknowledge that the whole thing is based upon this occult ideology behind the scenes. And most certainly it is, and of course these things were steered and guided and directed from powers above and beyond just this German regime itself. The banking class had a lot to do with this as well. And those within the topmost echelons of the secret society groups most certainly had something to do with this. Those dark occultists who run things in this world, behind the scenes, were steering and guiding and directing some of this stuff, and unleashed some of these ideologies upon the people in the Reich. And they acted upon their beliefs in various ways, and we see the atrocities that are accredited to World War II having taken place. Now, are some of the numbers that they give us misconstrued or disingenuous? I don't know. I don't claim to know. But certainly there was more going on behind the scenes in the hidden esoteric realm of things than what we have been told about this, and we understand the mainstream historical narrative that has been accepted about this, but certainly there's much that is still hidden behind the veil that is now coming to light about a lot of these things that have taken place. We know what the mainstream history teaches us about the events of World War II, but there were also hidden agendas, hidden streams of knowledge and power that continued on since that time, and some would argue that a Fourth Reich has been installed in places in this world, a Fourth Reich which represents a new world order. And are they wrong? I don't know. Hard to say for sure. Whatever you call this, certainly we see the influences of the secret society groups within the various governments, corporations, philanthropic organizations, places of power in this world. We see them at play. Now, whether this is an organized grasp at the reins of power by some regime that would refer to itself as a Reich is another story altogether. I don't know if that's the case, but certainly these secret society groups have had the hidden hand at play within many things in this world and continue to do so even unto today, because that is how these groups operate. They like to infiltrate. They like to put their own assets into positions of power in places of prominence wherein they can do things and get things done, promote agendas, get their ideologies out there for the masses. And it's no different here, and we can see the influence of these esoteric or occult Nazi ideologies still present today. In fact, they even still like to use the term Nazism or Nazi. And usually they'll attach this to some far-right ideology when Nazism itself is actually a left-wing ideology. But we see, once again, the inversion principle at play with that. And we see how they've equated the word with this negative influence and how it's become synonymous with evil. And certainly they utilize this to their benefit. They leverage that term in ways that paint a certain people group with the same broad brush. And they apply it however it suits them at the time to promote their agenda that they're pushing. So that being the case, we see how even the vernacular that's used, how they've weaponized the language against us with this stuff, and how it ties back to some of these accepted historical narratives that we've been handed. And we also see that there's something esoteric lying just beneath the surface when you understand everything that's construed therein. So without further ado, let's go ahead and we'll get into the reading here. And like I said, I will offer some of my insights and my personal opinions on this as well. But we have this notion of dark initiates within the Nazi Party. Let's get right into it. The 12 years during which the Nazi Party ruled Germany and much of Europe were so fundamentally governed by irrational and even magical thinking that the whole period has sometimes been referred to as the Occult Reich. Hitler, Hess, Göring, Himmler, Bormann, Goebbels, and Rosenberg were simply the most prominent believers in a way of thought that was entirely at odds with the secular thinking that had come to prevail in Europe. When the Third Reich was no more than a smoldering ruin, the Allied conquerors took a number of statements from Nazi Party members and discovered many documents about the way in which a range of occult notions had come to dominate the thinking of the most powerful leaders within Germany. They were so astonished by what they discovered that the evidence was deliberately suppressed at the Nuremberg trials for fear that it would allow the defense lawyers to plead insanity on behalf of their clients. I'm going to pause right there, folks. Were you aware of that? Were you aware that they suppressed information at the Nuremberg trials pertaining to these occult concepts that were believed and acted upon by the leadership in power in Germany at the time? Did you know that? Probably not. Why would they suppress this information? Well, we have this explanation here. The lawyers would plead insanity for them, and they were afraid that they would not be tried for their war crimes. That's the official explanation. But in my estimation, and based upon the things I know about these occult fraternities, and how they've infiltrated into all levels of power in society, I would say there's an ulterior motive here for hiding this. Because you see, there's this broad network of occult powers and secret society groups that steer and manipulate and run society in this world. And they all have the same people at the topmost levels of that power structure, and it was to protect themselves from being discovered as well. Of course, everything is always tucked away behind the veil of secrecy with these people. So they didn't want a lot of this occult stuff to come out, because had it come out, perhaps some of them would be discovered to be involved in some way, shape, or form with this. Now, this is speculation on my part. I can't say for certain. I wasn't there. I don't know what really happened. But the simple fact that they suppressed information at the Nuremberg trials is troubling and problematic. You see, that tells us that there's something disingenuous about the Nuremberg trials. Were these people really tried for their war crimes? Or is this just the accepted narrative handed to us by the mainstream, by the press at the time? Now recorded in the history books, were there really these trials? Did they go on, or was it all for show? You have to ask these questions. Now, I'm not of the camp that says everything's fake. Certainly, real events do happen in this world, and they leverage them all the time. And certainly, I would hope that human decency would prevail, and some of these people would be held accountable for their actions. I think that's a very real possibility, but the fact that information was suppressed in regards to what is considered to be the most brutal atrocities of the history of the world that occurred at this time, that's problematic. Wouldn't you want to get all the information on the table? You would think you would want to understand, why do these psychopaths behave the way they do, and what can we do about that? But they brushed it under the rug, folks. And I would argue they have an ulterior motive to doing so, not just because they were afraid that the lawyers for these war criminals would claim that they were insane and use an insanity defense. I don't think that stands to scrutiny. Atrocities are atrocities. War crimes are a whole different level of criminality than other types of crimes in this world. So I don't think an insanity defense would be viable in this case. So it seems to me there's something disingenuous here given to us. Why suppress that information? Well, let's get a little deeper into this, and we'll see what else we can ascertain from this. How did it come about that Germany, a nation more closely identified than most with the spirit of rationality and enlightenment, had fallen under the control of a group of people who utterly rejected these views, preferring instead to follow the promptings of occultists and to espouse pseudo-scientific theories of race, superhuman beings and the virtue of genocide as a means of purifying Germany and eventually the world of corruption of inferior races. Gonna pause there once again. This is the big question, isn't it? You see, all of this ties back to these old occult ways of thinking, these old esoteric doctrines, the secret doctrine espoused by the secret society groups and the occult fraternities today. This notion that there are some races of mankind that are more spiritually evolved than others and therefore superior to others. That's where all of these ideologies derive from. You see, was no different in Nazi Germany. Now the argument in Nazi Germany became, well, who were the superior races? Who were the more evolved race groups? And you could argue the semantics of that all day long. But certainly, these belief systems underlied everything that they did. You see, they believed in what they call the Aryan race. And we've explored some of these ideas in past shows here, looking at where these ideas come from, how they are deeply rooted in occultism, in the secret teachings, the secret doctrine, held up by all of these occult fraternities and secret society groups. They all have common roots and common themes that run through them. And this is at the core of all of that. And we can see how many of these ideas were twisted, perverted, contorted, and inverted and foisted upon the minds of men during a very specific time frame in the mid to late 1800s. These ideas were foisted upon those who looked at the occult with interest during those times. And they began to introduce these ideas slowly into the mainstream rational thinking of the masses. And they adopted the guise of scientism, or what we would call modern science, to foist these ideas upon mankind. And from these ideologies that derive from these occult teachings, we were introduced with the ideas of eugenics, Darwinian evolution, and all of the other aspects of that have crept into our modern ways of thinking and our modern society, and they're all based upon these same ideologies that the Nazis carried out in a real-world, active manner. They acted upon their beliefs in these systems, these ideologies. And this stands as a perfect example of the atrocities that can be committed in the name of the quote-unquote greater good. That's what they believed they were doing. They believed they were working for the greater good. If you buy the mainstream narrative here. Even if you don't buy the mainstream narrative, you could see how these contorted viewpoints brought about these atrocities. And I would say these atrocities probably ran far deeper than what we're told. Not so much necessarily in the numbers of people they allegedly euthanized, but in the greater impact on the social norms of society. You see, they carried out a eugenics program on a massive scale, the likes of which hasn't been seen in the world up until that point. And we're only now in the modern era seeing something more atrocious coming about. That is a eugenics program, the horrors of which we won't know for another few years yet. But that's a story for another day. I don't want to mention too much about that right now. because I want this show to run on various platforms where it will be heard by larger numbers of people. So I'm not going to go into details on that, but we can make the connections all day long with some things, but certainly we understand the atrocities that were committed under the regime of Nazi Germany, under the guise of the Third Reich. Let's continue here and see what else we can learn. Hitler's introduction to the occult. The trail begins 6 years before the commencement of the First World War. When the young Hitler was living in poverty in Vienna, he made friends with another dweller at the Hostel for the Homeless, Joseph Greiner. He introduced Hitler to a number of magical practices and showed him how to develop the power to control people and events. Hitler saw the new vistas that Greiner had shown him as offering the opportunities to escape from his present situation and translate his grandiose visions and ideas into reality through using the methods he had learned from his friend. Hitler began studying hypnotism, yoga, and other disciplines that he believed would help to strengthen his willpower. He attempted to move objects from a distance by focusing his will upon the exercise and dowsed for water in the woods around Vienna. Hitler studied astrology, learning to draw up and cast a horoscope. He also learned numerology, graphology, assessing character from handwriting, and physiognomy, the art of judging people by their face and body language. Hitler sometimes tried to test the strength of his willpower by holding his hand under a burning gas jet. The fact that Greiner introduced Hitler to a number of occult practices is confirmed by others who knew him at the time, particularly Reinhold Hanisch, who, like Greiner, shared a friendship with him at various Doss houses in Vienna. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So Hitler was introduced to some of these occult practices, these magical practices, early on, just prior to World War I, by some of his friends. And you see, he was all about focusing his willpower. We've talked about the importance of the will in magical workings and the like here before. And certainly these ideas were not foreign to Hitler, and as we'll see, there were some within his circles of influence and power in the Nazi Party and within the Third Reich who had far more knowledge of these things than Hitler did. Let's continue. In 1909, at the age of 20, Hitler met with Adolf Lanz, the head of an occult group based in Vienna. Lanz also published a newsletter called Ostara. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. Ostara. That means the star. Hitler regularly bought this paper from a local tobacconist's shop and met Lanz on a number of occasions where he received further occult training. Lanz's newspaper and pamphlets first awakened Hitler's anti-Semitic prejudices, though they did not become fully formed until around 1920. Lanz began his career as a Cistercian monk, but was expelled from his monastery at the age of 25 for carnal and worldly thoughts. He immediately became an ardent German nationalist and a fierce anti-Semite who also attacked the Jesuits. Lanz also discarded the plain heir Adolf Lanz, to which he was entitled, and began styling himself as Baron Georg Lanz von Liebenfels. His occult group, the Order of the New Templars, was consciously modeled upon the Catholic Church. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this guy espoused anti-Semitic ideas. He also espoused a disdain for the Jesuits, but he founded his own secret society group, the New Templars, and modeled it upon the Catholic Church, which is also the same model the Jesuits used So that's an interesting juxtaposition in thinking, isn't it? And we see how many of the things that go on behind the scenes within the secret society groups oftentimes don't stand up to scrutiny. We see this conflict between the Jesuit side of things and the Freemasonic side of things, but they're all playing for the same team. They just approach things with some different strategies, and they disagree on strategy. They agree on the ultimate outcomes, but they disagree on strategy. And we see a lot of this happens at the highest, most levels of the echelons of these secret society groups. And I think it's the same thing going on here. They disagree upon the means to bring about the ends, but they agree upon what the ends should be. So we see an example of this in Lanza's opinions about the Jesuits and his opinions about certain racial groups. Let's read on. Lanz set up centers for his Aryan heroes in various castles that he acquired for his order. By the 1920s, they owned 4 castles, a house in Salzburg, and a cell in Hungary. He declared that the Aryan hero is on this planet the most complete incarnation of God and the Spirit. Unfortunately, he had a bitter enemy known as Chandala, the Underman. The Chandala promoted democracy, capitalism, and materialism. It was because the Aryan heroes had mixed their blood with apes that their race had degenerated. The age of Aquarius would see the triumph of the newly racially purified Aryan over the sin of mingling his blood with that of lesser races. And I'm going to pause again for a moment here. We've discussed some of the foundations of where this ideology comes from. Coming from the Rosicrucian teachings, coming from the Theosophical teachings, coming from the secret doctrine, which permeates all of these occult groups, that can be traced back quite a long ways. And this could be traced back to their traditions concerning the Lemurian race and the rise of the Atlantean races. You see in some of their secret teachings and their secret doctrine, they claim that the early Lemurian races were guilty of what they called the sin of mindlessness, where they tried to procreate with different beasts of the earth, and that they really were not fully developed intellectually as modern humans are. And it wasn't until the later sub-races of the Lemurian epoch that man later evolved into the coming Atlantean racial structure and the racial subgroups, and then from there into what we would call the modern man. And this is what is acknowledged by the secret schools as the beginnings of the Aryan races, the root race of modern man. So these ideas have permeated into the Nazi way of thinking, and that's what he's talking about here. So he's conflated the average human being of today with having this sin of having mingled his blood with apes or lesser races. And we see where the ideology of Darwinian evolution comes into play here as well, don't we? How it's a conflating and a misrepresentation of the secret doctrine. How it's a twisting and a contorting of this secret doctrine. Leveraging, I think that's the best term, leveraging the secret doctrine into affecting the world mind in a very negative way. So this is what was done by the introduction of these ideas. And the Third Reich took these ideas to an extreme and acted upon them to an extreme, and introduced evils into the world that had hitherto been unimaginable. So this is what we're talking about here. So we have these core teachings of this secret doctrine influencing the ways in which these people think. And of course, they conflate the average public, the masses, with having this original sin that they wanted to purify from the masses, by only sticking to the pure Aryan races, being able to reproduce and repopulate the earth. So you can understand where a lot of this comes from. This notion of the sin of mindlessness. And then maybe you could begin to understand why some of these people within the high echelons of these occult fraternities and with the high echelons of power in this world are obsessed with genealogy. Then you can understand why they are obsessed with certain aspects of human genetics, things like the Rh factor of the blood, because they mistakenly conflate this with this intermingling of the blood here, of the superior races with the lesser races. And it all ties back to this secret doctrine, of course. So now, let's continue on here, now that we added a little bit of context to what was revealed there. The order laid down strict racial criteria for membership, including not simply blonde hair and blue eyes, but large heads, small hands, and small feet. All those who joined his new templars had to promise to marry racially pure women. Lanz claimed that, quote, through women, sin came into the world, and it is so over and over again because woman is especially susceptible to the love artifices of her animal-like inferiors, end quote. The rather unedifying slogan of his order was, quote, race war until the castration knife, end quote. Joseph Greiner, folks. This guy had a very real influence on Hitler and Nazism. Adolf Lanz also inspired Hitler and the Reich. Let's continue. Lanz was also an obsessional advocate of nudism and devoted several issues of Ostara to the subject. He believed in a lost paradise where nude Aryans consorted in racially pure liaisons with Aryan women. The fall came about through Aryan females breeding with the dark races, and Jesus, whom Lanz called Fraja, came to save them by issuing a new commandment, quote, love thy neighbor as thyself, if he is a member of your own race, end quote. He also denounced what he called interracial sexual relationships and demanded forced labor and a starvation diet as punishment for these offenses, calling for the extirpation of the animal man and the propagation of the higher new man through selective breeding, sterilization, forced labor, transportation to the ape jungle, and even murder. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Now, all of this, of course, is a very twisted ideology. You see, they even tried to invoke Jesus in their belief systems. And this has no basis in reality whatsoever, no basis in any type of interpretation of Jesus' teachings whatsoever. This is wherein a select group of radicals took, twisted, and contorted many things to promote their own viewpoints, agendas, and ideologies. And they took these things to an extreme. And like I said, this all ties back to the secret doctrine. So we see all of these things that they claim that they're doing in the name of the greater good. So it's an interesting set of circumstances here that led up to the atrocities of World War II. When you understand the occult belief systems of those who were able to put themselves in these positions of power, and most certainly I would argue there were those in the banking cartels and other places that most definitely wanted to set these people in positions of power to promote certain ideologies, to bring about changes in this world that would further their great work. that they made it possible for these psychopaths to ascend into positions of power and to do the things they've done. Of course, these people will always remain quietly behind the veil to steer and direct things from behind the scenes, while these public faces of the atrocities take the blame. I would say this was steered from above just this one small government, this one small Reich that steered and directed and guided things and foisted these evils upon the world. Well, certainly they had to have backing from somewhere. They had to have financial means supplied from somewhere. And if you get into the mainline history of World War II, you understand that there were certain banking interests that funded them. So questions need to be asked. How much of this did they know about? How far did this secret doctrine permeate into the control structure of this world? And who had a vested interest in this stuff coming about? You have to ask the questions. I don't have the answers, folks, nor do I claim to have the answers. But we can learn a few things by looking at the historical narratives we are given about these events. And we could go back and we could look at the history of where some of this stuff comes from. And as always, like I always say, it always invariably falls back to the occult, no matter what. Wish that was not the case, but it always is. You always find the occult at the heart of all of this. It's no different here. Let's continue on and we'll see what else we can learn here. Lanz called his bizarre system of racial mythology Ariosophy, and it involved a number of eccentric beliefs centered on the idea that when the Bible spoke of angels, it meant Aryan heroes. In his fantasies, subhuman races emerged in the days of Atlantis and Lemuria. Lanz rejected the idea that humans had evolved from apes. His theories regarded apes as fallen men. Jews, Czechs, and Slovenes were the three ethnic groups for whom he harbored particular hatred, and in his eyes they had evolved through intermixing blood between Aryans and apes. His Aryans were destined to be the master race and would lord it over inferior ethnic groups. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now you can see Lanz had inferred an esoteric interpretation into what's been described as Darwinian evolution. You see, he saw the description of apes as being those fallen men who had intermixed their blood racially with the inferior groups, with the inferior races, the throwbacks to Lemuria from the Atlantean culture. So this was always inherent, even within the early application of Darwinian evolution and eugenics ideas. I'm sure he didn't just come up with this himself. He probably inherited these beliefs from those within the occult fraternities that were prominent during the introduction of these ideas into mainstream science in the mid to late 1800s. But of course, they have to have their scapegoat, their fall guy. And that's who this Lanz fellow appears to have been, in some regard here. So he espoused these ideas, which were probably handed to him by earlier groups of occultists who believed this. And they also encoded these ideas in the mainstream science. You see, they probably, when they were making the claims through Darwinian evolution that man evolved from some common ancestor as apes, there was probably a hidden esoteric nugget in there that the quote-unquote apes they're referring to are different than what we would consider apes today. You see, they do this all the time. I've discovered this in so many scientific writings that it's just astounding. There's coded language in all of it, and only if you have eyes to see, if you have the correct cipher for understanding what's being said there through the esoteric lens of things, can you understand what's being presented. And like everything else that's been done by these occult fraternities and mystical societies that run things in this world, these dark occultists who run things, they hide their esoteric information within an exoteric form of information. And the exoteric form of information is that which is publicly accepted by the mainstream and acknowledged as true, acknowledged as science, when in fact there's no basis in reality to it at all. It is simply there to hide something else, an esoteric doctrine. This is the same with Darwinian evolution. This is a prime example of that. Because you see, through the introduction of that idea, they have twisted and contorted the human psyche into accepting certain things that are not true as being true and foundational, steering man away from spiritual things, grounding him purely in physical materiality here, making him believe the teachings of humanism, secular humanism, making man accept ideas like there is no God, there is no absolute moral standard of right or wrong, there's only moral relativism, and man is his own God, and man can become God through his intellect. This is the heart of the Luciferian doctrine, folks. This is the Luciferian philosophy disguised as science. They want man to accept that 20 billion years ago, nothing exploded and became everything, and that we're all some random accident here. There is no creator, there is no God, there is no higher power that we are answerable to. Only man. They want you to believe man invented the idea of God, that man just somehow accidentally evolved here. It doesn't stand to reason when you look at the intelligence inherent in the natural world around you. But this is what they've programmed people to believe, because they've expressed their esoteric doctrine in an exoteric manner, presented it as being scientifically valid, as being rational, hyper-rational, and objective. And they've influenced the human mind in such ways to accept absolute fallacies, to accept nonsense as truth. And in so doing, they've devolved us in certain ways. They've focused our attention on things that have no basis in fact, that have no basis in spiritual truth. They've focused us on this idea of evolution, when the reality is, within their secret doctrine, we should be focused on what they call involution, if they were to follow their own teachings. And this is what is part of this esoteric doctrine. But you see, they've taken the exoteric version of it, misconstrued it, accepted it as truth, and run to the extremes with it, and foisted it upon humanity, and we see the atrocities that have been committed in their belief in the absurdities. And was it not Voltaire that rightly told us that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities? And that's what's been done here. We could see that. This is a perfect example thereof. But anyway, let's continue reading here. It is not for nothing that in 1932 Lanz wrote in a private letter to one of his students that, quote, Hitler is one of our pupils, end quote. In 1934, he proudly claimed that his order was, quote, the first manifestation of National Socialism, end quote. And as late as 1951, he was still claiming to be the man who had inspired Hitler to adopt the final solution. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Was this guy really bragging in 1951 that he's the guy that inspired Hitler to commit war crimes and atrocities against humanity? I don't think I would want to go around bragging about that. It's not very smart, is it? But you see, it was probably more bragging for those within the occult fraternities to acknowledge him. That's probably what it's about. Just as a calling card. Let's continue reading. Next, we're going to look at this next section, which talks about the cosmic circle of Munich. Hitler was certainly influenced by Lanz's ideas, but it was to be another 6 years or so before he began to formulate anything approaching a coherent ideology. When he moved to Munich in 1913, Hitler settled in the Schwabing area, the Bohemian quarter of the city. As well as mixing with other artists, he also discovered the ideas of Alfred Schuller and Ludwig Derleth. Schuller was convinced of the importance of what he called pure blood, and was strongly anti-Semitic. Both men belonged to a group that aspired to turn Munich into the center of cosmic consciousness. Their goal was to replace the existing political, social, and religious structure of the world with what they called the Urheimat, or original home of the soul. They favored instinctive rather than rational thinking, advocated following the promptings of the unconscious mind, and tried to bring about a return to a more natural and primitive society. Schuller revered the Roman Empire and blamed the Jews and Christians for its collapse. He engaged in seances, healing rituals, and astral travel. Schuller stressed the sacredness of pure blood and adopted the swastika as his personal symbol. Hitler heard Schuller lecture in Vienna, and his friend Greiner developed an admiration for ancient Rome as a result. Schuller also led Hitler to become fascinated by the swastika symbol. He may have been a comparatively minor influence on the young Hitler, but he reinforced his racial obsessions and gave him the most potent emblem of Nazism, the swastika. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this symbol that has come to represent Nazism, the swastika, is actually something far older. Had mystical significance and value prior to that, but you see, like everything else, this symbol has been hijacked now by an evil ideology and has come to represent that. It's been changed in the public consciousness. So the human psyche sees this symbol as an archetype for evil now. That wasn't always what the symbol represented. But this is how, oftentimes, those with these esoteric agendas can influence human thought in many ways through the use of symbology. They adopted this symbol, committed atrocities in its name, and now it's forever emblazoned in the human psyche as a representative symbol of the evil that became manifest during World War II. But there are other hidden esoteric meanings behind this symbol, and it does have other archetypal representations inherent in it, and these can be used to influence human consciousness in many ways as well. And this has been done. But let's continue on and see what we could learn about this. Derleth subscribed to an even more bizarre belief system than Schuller. He was convinced that Schuller's seances were black magic rituals, and his own megalomania soon led to his notorious proclamations, in which he declared the imminent arrival of Christus Imperator Maximus. This coming savior of the world wanted death-hardened troops for the conquest of the globe. The last sentence of the proclamations became notorious. It says, quote, "Soldiers, I deliver unto you for plundering the world," end quote. His Reich of Christ the King found few disciples, but his ideas were widely publicized in Munich and were mentioned favorably by the Schwabinger Beobachter, the newspaper of the local Bohemian community. Hitler was aware of Derleth's proclamations and of his project for the establishment of the Rosenberg, his vision of an ideal city. The Rosenberg, though never more than a dream, was favorably commented upon by Lanz and other thinkers who influenced the young Hitler. It was also an ideal that Himmler found attractive when he came to consider his own vision of the utopian state over which he imagined his SS ruling in the event of final German victory. Derleth's fascination with alchemy, organic farming, living in harmony with nature, vegetarianism, spiritual development, and an order that created and ruled a golden society were decisive influences upon Himmler's conception of the world. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. Rosenberg, hearkening back to one of the main conduits of the secret teachings, the secret doctrine, the Rosicrucians, the rose always being an important symbol in all of this. A symbol of the new dawn, the new age, the rebirth of man in his next iteration, the post-human. Are you beginning to understand? Rosenberg, the city of the rose. You see, all of these ideas and influences permeated directly into the Third Reich, into the SS. And these were at the forefront of the minds of those leaders of these groups, guys like Himmler, who actually was very involved in occultism. Very involved with a lot of this stuff. Was one of the main conduits within the Nazi Party itself of much of the esoterica and the occult ideals that came about. One of the main directors of this occult war of Hitler. You see, this was more than just one country trying to conquer other lands and spread its influence. This had occult, spiritual components behind it. This was not a regular war campaign. This was not a regular conflict between peoples, as had been seen all throughout history. This was not just simply some empire trying to spread its influence and acquire new lands. This was deep-rooted. There was a spiritual component to this, a deep-rooted spiritual component that allowed this to devolve into such atrocity and human loss. There was a whole lot more going on behind the scenes with this. Of course, the mainstream history won't acknowledge much about that other than to say that, yes, there were some kooky guys within the Third Reich who were very interested in occult things. And some of the things they did seem to reflect that in some way, but it has nothing to do with the overall conception of what happened historically here. No, you see, they push that all under the rug. They don't want people to find the roots of where this comes from, because if they do, they would realize that there are others in the world today who harbor and promulgate some of these same ideas, these same conceptions, these same secret doctrines, and that they act upon their beliefs in these secret doctrines, and the things they do to act upon them that affect all of us will affect us in a negative way. They don't want people to come to that realization, so they don't talk about it. They just might put something interesting on the History Channel once in a while, acknowledging that, yes, Those within the Nazi Party, they were psychopaths. They were some kooky guys who believed in some really weird things. But, that has nothing to do with anything else today. All of that's since disappeared. That's what they want you to believe, that there's not anybody who still follows these ideologies today, except for maybe a couple of kooky right-wing conspiracy nuts that believe in that stuff. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because, like I said, Nazism in and of itself is a left-wing ideology rather than a right-wing ideology. But that's a story for another day. Not going to discuss the political ramifications here. That's what they like us to focus on. What are the political strings being pulled about this whole thing? What's the political side of this? And that's not what we're focusing on here, because you see, that's only a small fraction of what came about because of this conflict. You see, the atrocities of World War II introduced spiritual manifestations into this world that have brought about very much corruption and destruction into this world. That's the bottom line with this. But let's continue reading here, because we'll see 3 men who changed the course of Hitler's life. In 1919, Hitler met 3 men in Munich who, more than any others, profoundly shaped his thoughts and laid the foundation of his political career. All 3 were deeply involved in occult practices. The influence of Gottfried Feder, Dietrich Eckart, and Alfred Rosenberg proved decisive in the transforming him into the future leader of Germany. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So you had these 3 individuals who were deeply involved in occult practices, deeply rooted in the occult fraternities, who found Hitler, set him up as their guy, pushed him into this position where he will be the leader. You see, they found their puppet on a string, and they set him into that position as the scapegoat, as the sacrificial goat. They elevated him on the platform and put him into the public as the figurehead. This is always how this stuff comes about. Did you really think that the President of the United States is the one that runs things here? Do you really think the same was true of Germany during Hitler's rise to power? Do you think he was the one who was calling the shots on everything? I think you're vastly mistaken if you think that the figurehead is the guy who has all the power in any of these governmental systems. I think you're deluded. They're just put up there to be the scapegoat, the sacrificial goat for those who really get things done behind the scenes. So we see these guys had influence, and they elevated Hitler to this position. It began when Hitler attended a talk at the German Workers' Party on the 12th of September, 1919. The speaker was Feder, and the subject of his talk was capitalism and its evils. There were only 54 members of the party, few of them present that evening. Hitler listened to Feder's talk with fascination and was strongly attracted to the new economic ideas that he put forward. During the questions that followed the speaker's lecture, a member of the audience demanded that the state of Bavaria should secede from the rest of Germany and restore its former monarchy. Hitler stood up angrily and engaged in a passionate defense of a greater Germany that included not only the states that already belonged to it, but also Austria, Danzig, and all the German-speaking peoples. Having made his statement, he was about to make a rapid exit when the party leader, Anton Drexler, rushed after him and managed to get his address. He left the meeting, but received a membership card in the post the following day. Drexler and Feder were both deeply impressed with Hitler's charisma, speaking ability, and strength of conviction. As Drexler remarked after hearing Hitler speak, he said, quote, "My God, he's got the gift of gab, hasn't he? We could use him," end quote. As a result of the meeting, Hitler became the 55th member of the German Workers' Party and the 7th member of its committee given special responsibility for propaganda. Before long, it had been renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and Hitler became its leader. He was to transform it into a mass movement using a considerable extent the occult training he had received from the dark initiates of the Thule Group and the Vril Society. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. The Thule Group, the Thule Society, the Vril Society. Both of these esoteric groups had influenced Hitler and had a hand in his rise to power. You see, he was the 55th member. The esoteric numbers always come into play. 55. And the 7th on the committee. These are very loaded numbers in their significance in numerology, and don't let that escape you, but that's not the focus today. Just pointing out the facts that they leveraged every mystical connotation they can into promoting Hitler into this position. Very few of the ideas that the future Chancellor of Germany put forward during his political career were original. His economic policies were almost entirely derived from Fieder, and his anti-Semitism, still a relatively vague and incoherent prejudice before he met them, hardened into dogma as he swallowed the occult-based racial theories of Eckart and Rosenberg. Unlike Hitler, all three men came from wealthy middle-class families, and they decisively changed the direction of Hitler's life, and as a result, the future history of the world through their ability to provide more sophisticated justification for prejudices that, however deeply felt, had perhaps not been carefully formulated before. Dietrich Eckart, Hitler's spiritual father. Eckart knew that the German Workers' Party, even though he shared its beliefs, was incapable of ever becoming a mass movement without the right sort of person as its leader. He said in the spring of 1919, before he had met Hitler, quote, "We need a man at the head who can stand the sound of a machine gun. The best man for the job would be a worker who knows how to talk," end quote. Eckart was obsessed with the imminent arrival of a strong leader who would not only restore Germany to its former greatness, but would make it the most powerful nation on earth. He was immediately struck by Hitler's potential and became convinced that the young Austrian ex-corporal was the Messiah for whom he and the whole of Germany were waiting. Hitler was not from the upper or middle classes, so he had the ability to speak to the working classes as one of their own. His charisma and ability as a public speaker was beyond question. Eckart believed that Hitler could be molded into the future savior of Germany with sufficient training by himself and others who shared his own view of the world. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now we see how they foisted this mantle upon Hitler because he did have some natural charisma and speaking ability, and he had a core conviction of the beliefs of these same people, so he was easily molded and guided by them. And he came from more humble beginnings than these folks. And isn't this always the case with a lot of this? Many of those within these secret society groups oftentimes belong to wealthy families or higher upper middle class families. And they don't really have a clue as to the struggles of those of the lower classes. So they can't really relate. So they need to find somebody who maybe espouses some of the same beliefs that they do, that has a little bit of speaking ability and can understand and persuade those of the lower classes to accept some of their doctrines. And Hitler fit the mold they were looking for. So they elevated him to this level of savior, and you see this was a false savior, and we see the comparisons to Messiah and Savior here. This infers that Hitler was a type of Antichrist, a prototype model for Antichrist, in the Antichrist system to come. They set him up as a savior for the German people. They had broader goals in mind, though. A more far-reaching agenda. But they were cultivating Hitler to carry out this position. Let's continue on. Eckart nurtured Hitler carefully and initiated him into a range of occult ideas and practices. He introduced him to 3 magical orders. Pay attention. The Thule Group, the Armanin Order, and the Vril Society. From them, Hitler learned the techniques of occult concentration, of visualization, and of developing the power to direct his will to influence events and other people. Going to pause for a moment there, folks. These are magical practices. We've touched upon these before in some past episodes here. It's all about directing the will to influence other people and events. There are magical practices that have been put into place by many of these occult fraternities for a long time that claim to be able to have some impact on the world around them, as we've discussed here before. Now, are there some kernels of truth to some of this? Perhaps, perhaps not. I don't claim to know all of the truth here, but I do think that there are inherently kernels of truth in all of these things, but they always have that bit of poison mixed in. And that is wherein you need to apply your discernment to figure out what's true and what's not true, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is good and what is evil. And without a proper moral compass to do so, you'll be lost. You see, if you buy into the ideologies of secular humanism and of moral relativism, you won't have a basis or a foundation to stand upon that is firm, and you will be subverted in that way by these occult belief systems. That's exactly what they've tried to leverage against humanity and society at large. That's why they try to steer us into these modes of what they call scientific rationalism, science, the purely physical material world belief systems that they foist upon us. You see, they want you to think things like religion and philosophy are silly notions, backward superstitions of a primitive era that we no longer need, because now we have the all-knowing and all-powerful science, the end-all be-all of the answers to the mysteries of the universe. Nothing could be further from the truth, folks, because they try to separate out spiritual truths from these things. This is one of the methods and means by which they've steered humanity into this trap of accepting this coming Antichrist system, this beast system. Because when you have no moral basis of foundation to stand upon, then they can convince you of the truth of absurdities, and then also convince you to commit atrocities in the name of those absurdities, as Voltaire so rightly told us. And that is certainly the fallacy that they stand upon. That's why I will still maintain that, quote-unquote, science is the god of the New Age, more rightly called scientism. And all of their scientism ideas or scientific ideas have no firm foundation, but yet they've foisted them upon the world. Things like these racial tensions that we have come directly from the old secret doctrine. Teachings like Darwinian evolution come from the old secret doctrine. And they have no basis in fact, but they are accepted as fact because it's been pounded into your head through propaganda and through validation of their beliefs by spurious methods. Consensus reality. They like to use the term consensus. The scientific consensus is evolution is a fact. Really? I don't think it is. We've never witnessed true speciation, but yet they claim this is fact. It's all taken on the basis of faith, just like anything else. But anyway, we see how some of these ways of thinking have been leveraged against the masses. And we can see as an example here that it's always these dark occultists who run things and their minions within the secret society groups that seem to guide and direct world leaders into certain actions. This is a prime example, and that's why it's important that we look at this. Because most of the mainstream historical authorities won't acknowledge this or even bring this up. They might mention it as an aside. Oh yeah, there were some of these occult groups that had interest in things, and many within the Nazi Party were interested in this stuff, but it really had no bearing on the overall war itself. It's just that they had this extreme hatred for certain racial groups. They won't bring this up. They won't say who influenced this stuff from above. Let's continue on, and we're going to wrap it up. Eckart firmly believed that he was in contact with the secret chiefs, mysterious beings who were variously thought to live in the air, in the mountain fastnesses of Tibet, or in the very center of the earth. He thought he had power to summon them and set them to work on behalf of Germany, and that Hitler was the earthly instrument for channeling their power. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road, and this is where historians won't touch this with a 10-foot pole. Eckart firmly believed he was in contact with the quote-unquote secret chiefs. Spiritual beings, spiritual intelligences that guide and direct things beyond human intelligences, that influence world events, demonic forces, if you will. Now, this is where they won't touch it with a 10-foot pole, like I said. These were the spiritual influences that directed these sick individuals. And see, they don't want you to acknowledge the spiritual, so they'll just tell you these guys were some wackadoodles for sure. And they believed in some of these weird occult things, but they hid all of this information from the Nuremberg trials because they didn't want their lawyers to come back and say they were insane and get away with their crimes, when in fact there's probably something more nefarious going on. They don't want people to understand that there are these significant spiritual influences that control and direct and guide things in this world, and that these dark occultists who run things in this world take their directives from these dark powers, for the Bible does inform us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and the powers of darkness in high places. And certainly they don't want to acknowledge anything like that in the mainstream historical narrative, because this implies that there is a God, that there is a higher power, that there are these spiritual realms that influence the spiritual and the physical world here, and that there's more to reality than just this physical, material world in which we exist. They don't want people to realize that or understand that in any significant way. So they've leveraged the principles of scientism against us. And they don't want us to acknowledge this in the historical record. They just want us to focus on the strictly physical aspects of this. How many people were killed in the gas chambers? Of what racial stock were those people? Why do we have all of this hatred, this ideology of hatred? Well, certainly it has to be because of capitalism. Or it has to be because of intolerant people like Christians. You see how they try to steer and direct these ways of thinking into something that has no basis in fact. So this guy, who was the main influence, the spiritual father of Hitler, he believed he was in contact with the secret chiefs, these spiritual beings who guide and direct from above. This, in and of itself, should be a concerning thing. Let's continue on, and we're going to wrap it up. Kurt Ludeck was a close friend of Hitler for many years and described Eckart as, quote, something of a genius, and to a great degree the spiritual father of Hitler and the grandfather for the Nazi movement, end quote. For his part, Eckart told Rosenberg, quote, let it happen as it will and must, but I believe in Hitler. Above him there hovers a star, end quote. A star, folks. One of the 1,000 points of light, as so aptly mentioned by George Bush back in 1991. In one of his well-known speeches, The 1,000 Points of Light. So Hitler was to become one of these 1,000 points of light, according to the secret schools. And you see, there's a lot you don't know about those who belong to these secret society groups, how they hold Hitler in high esteem. Certainly you wouldn't know that from the public record, would you? Like Fieder, Eckart was deeply hostile to capitalism. Fieder, at least at first, did not regard his anti-capitalist views as being necessarily connected with anti-Semitism, but Eckart firmly believed that the Jews were the masterminds behind capitalism. Through his newspaper, Auf gut Deutsch, and his authorship of a number of pamphlets, particularly the incendiary To All Workers, he built a following among the thousands of Germans who felt dispossessed and alienated at the end of the First World War. Under Eckart's influence, first Fieder, and then Hitler came to look on the Jews as the source of all the evils in the world. And I think we're going to leave it right there, folks. Because you see how this whole notion of anti-Semitism in the modern era really got foisted and elevated into prominence. And these same types of spiritual influences are being invoked and leveraged today. And I don't think that these things are how the public at large truly thinks of one another. I honestly think the vast majority of people don't care about race or religion of their fellow human beings. They all just want to coexist together. They want to live their lives, be left alone, don't have any particular hatreds one toward another. But you see, these spiritual powers, for lack of a better term, seem to come into manifestation through the manipulation of those who control media and government, the wheels of propaganda. And we can see this going on in real time across the television today in the news cycle. You see, they have this harboring of hatred on display in the news media when you look at some of these events that have been organized. These ones that call themselves pro-Palestinian protests, and of course, you have the other side of that, the pro-Israeli protests, going on at college campuses around the country, and many of these events look to me to be organized events, provocateur events that are probably likely bankrolled by certain interest groups to introduce and foist this spirit of racial divide upon the masses through the use of this propaganda tool. You see, all of these things have always been leveraged to one degree or another by the power structure. And we're seeing it play out here in real time in the world today, aren't we? They're reinvoking some of these same spiritual powers that were manifest during World War II. So we see many of the same foundational bases for this coming about today. We see some of the same reactionary movements coming about today. We see some of the commonalities. Well, why are there commonalities? Because it is the same groups of dark occultists who run things in this world that are trying to stir the tensions back up, and these same spiritual powers in high places, the powers of darkness, that Ephesians 6:12 warn us about, that are becoming manifest again to bring about massive changes in humanity. And it all has to do with these same occult teachings that Hitler and the Nazi Party espoused. It just looks a little different right now than it did then. That's the only thing that differentiates it. It looks slightly different. Is there a Fourth Reich that has instantiated itself into positions of power? If there is, folks, it's run by these same dark occultists and these same spiritual forces that guide and direct them, as did World War II, the events of World War II. Always at the heart of all of it is the occult, folks. I wish this wasn't the case, but it always is. And when you can understand this context of things and look at the world and the events of the world through this context and understand there's spiritual battles being played behind the scenes that guide and direct world affairs, then you'll have better discernment for things going on today. It's not all some random happenstance and coincidence, political machinations of things that happen by accident or coincidence. It's all steered and guided and directed by these spiritual forces behind the scenes. There's a war going on, folks. A spiritual war. An occult war. the Nazis were carrying out their part in this occult war. You see, they were guided by these evil influences that want to wage this occult war against God's creation. And we are still in the throes of this occult war. It has never ended. It has just operated covertly since that time. And every once in a while we see the manifestations of it cropping up around us. And now I would say we're on the precipice of a major spiritual conflict coming into being here. We're in the throes of it right now, and we're going to see it begin to manifest in physical, real-world types of ways very soon, I assure you. We're already seeing its effects. The problem is the tools that they have to manipulate people are far greater today than they were then. They can utilize these to great effect to steer the masses into behaving in ways that they want, believing things that they want. You need to have more discernment than ever before. Understand where we're at in the cycles of time. Understand we're living in the days of revelation, when the things that were done in the dark for the longest time are now coming to the light of day. The veil is being torn away, folks. We're beginning to see what's been going on for a long, long time. We're beginning to see the truth about the spiritual forces behind this. And yet there are so many that will stick their head in the sand and refuse to acknowledge it because it shakes up their worldview. Cognitive dissonance is a real thing, folks, and most people don't want to acknowledge the uncomfortable fact that there are spiritual things that have sway here, that there is a creator, there is a God, a higher power that we may need to answer to. Makes people uncomfortable. They don't want to acknowledge that. They would rather think there's some random accident in this universe, that they're not responsible for the things they do, that they have no real effect because they're just minuscule specks of sand flying through space on a rock, the infinite void, meaninglessness. That's what the material paradigm wants people to believe they are, but we are far more than that. We are spiritual beings on a physical journey here, not merely physical beings that turned up here accidentally through the great cosmic scheme and are destined to return to the dust. It's a spiritual war, folks. They're trying to disconnect man from anything spiritual, reject spiritual truth, and be focused only on the material paradigm. And we see this manifestation of this in the world. But at a higher level, it's all about this secret doctrine. You see, as I always tell you, they have no place in their new age for the profane, and that's you and I. They think that only they are worthy of advancing into the future of post-humanism, becoming gods themselves, the apotheosis of those of the more spiritually evolved races, according to their own secret doctrine beliefs. The rest of us, they don't intend to take with them. When you understand that ideology, you understand what lies behind the things that happen in this world. And when you understand the falsehoods upon which they found their stances You know that it's destined to failure because it has no firm foundation. But they may succeed for a time. And that could be problematic for a large number of people, but we need to stand firm in our religious or our spiritual convictions. We need to develop that right relationship with God, because that's what it's about. More so than any religious type practice, it's a relationship with God, the Creator. And if you have that, you will persevere. You will be fine. But there are many in this world that are lost. And they believe all the nonsense that they're programmed with by these dark spiritual powers, by these dark occultists that run things, and by their minions in this world that firmly believe that science is the answer to everything, the be-all, end-all, and that humankind's ultimate destiny is to become post-human, to become God themselves. That's the ideology they espouse, and it's all based on falsehood and lies. It is the great lie from the Garden of Eden. Man cannot be as gods, as was promised him, or told him, or lied to him about by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. But that is what science would have you believe. Scientism, I should say more rightly. Because that's what they think, that's what they push and promote. And of course, that science has been foisted upon us by these same dark occultists who run things and the powers above them in the spiritual that guided and directed this Nazi occult war, because that's what it was all about. You see, the Nazis, they also were grounded in the ideas of science. They developed high sciences. And they found ways to justify their belief systems by applying these sciences in those ways which reified their beliefs. And we see the same thing going on today. Is there a Fourth Reich running things? I don't know. I don't know if it could be rightly called that, but certainly we have these same spiritual influences running things and guiding and directing things today that we need to be mindful of. And of course, we do have the power to overcome them if we have our right relationship with our Creator, and we can reject their offers to us. Only problem is most people are unaware that this is even going on and don't want to acknowledge that there's a spiritual side to this that is a reality that they need to contend with. And each of us as an individual needs to come to these realizations and make decisions in this regard. Where will you stand? That's the bottom line. That's the big question. Anyway, I wanted to explore this way of thinking. I wanted to take a look back at this because we could point to this as an example of how these spiritual realities can manifest in a very physical world type of way here, and how those under the influence of these spiritual powers can commit major atrocities through the promotion of their absurdities. This is an important lesson for us to understand. This stands as a prime example of how those within these dark occult fraternities influence and direct people and foist them into positions of power on the world stage where they can push and promote their dark agendas. And we see the results. And we have a perfect historical account of that here. And analyzing the mystical roots associated with it, where it all comes from, we could once again point back to this secret doctrine that has permeated all of our modern thoughts, and we don't even realize it. But there you go, the Nazi occult war. It's the same occult war going on today, just under different names with different circumstances. Same spiritual attachments thereof, though. That's the bottom line here. Anyway, that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now.